This presentation is going to give you an introduction to the subject of culture in organisations. And culture is a subject that generates a lot of literature, both academic and management books. As we've seen, leadership theories have evolved, and a dominant way of thinking about leadership is one whereby leadership influences and is influenced by culture. Think transformational change often talks about changing culture. I'm going to give you a brief overview of 3 ways of thinking or presenting culture, and also ask, can we change culture? The reason for this last question is important because we are here to talk about leadership, so we need to understand if one can impact on the other. One often description or definition of culture is very simple. It's, as it says on the screen, the way we do things around here. This definition provides a really helpful overview, and for me I think it does capture the essence of culture. But as I'm saying, it is a very narrow, and for the benefit of our learning, is an oversimplified view of culture. The ideas of culture was actually born out from social anthropologists' approach to studying indigenous people whilst they were travelling. And what it was used to do was to understand and unravel the dynamics of, in their case, unfamiliar tribes. So it's much more about understanding the huge level of complexity and detail of the relationships in terms of the way we live our lives. I'm just going to take you through 3 particular definitions of culture just to give you a flavour of this subject area. The first is Shine, and he provides us, I think, a really helpful and visual way of understanding culture. Handy provides a more technical description, if you like, of what organisation culture is, or 4 types of organisation cultures that he's identified in organisations. And finally, we'll look at Johnson and Scholes' view of and suggested approach to better understanding the complexity of organisations and their cultures. If we use Shine to help expand on our initial definition of the culture as the way we do things around here, Shine describes culture in much more detail. So a pattern of basic assumptions invented, discovered or developed by a given group as it learns to cope with its problems of external adaptation and internal integration that has worked well enough to be taught to new members as the correct way to perceive, think and feel in relation to those problems. So Shine's work is absolutely focusing on the way organisations respond, in particular when things go badly as well as when they go well. But when they go badly, they look at how organisations respond, how people respond to that issue, and people learn from those issues and that time what is a good response and what is a bad response, and that learned behaviour then informs the future development of that organisation and culture. Shine goes on to explain a bit more about what he means. Shine breaks down his understanding and definition of culture into 3 components. He describes the first level as the artefacts, so the things we can see, the really obvious things we can see. So in terms of the university, that might be the way we dress, the buildings themselves, here in front Haylog, or the main arts building, the stories, the history of the university, or the School of Health Sciences, or your own organisations that you might work for. The next level Shine talks about are values. And those are the things which aren't necessarily visible, but are the things that if you talk to people that work in that organisation, they may then become clear about how they work. And that might be some of the processes that people follow, or the mission statement or vision is often shared in many organisations. So there are things that might inform the way people operate that you can see or understand or potentially read. The final and third level of Shine's understanding of culture is assumptions. So those are the things that help to define how or what people do in an organisation, and they're the firmly held beliefs of that group, and as it says on the screen, they're held unconsciously. So if we go back to that original definition, These are behaviours that are learned when things go wrong or when things go well, and people unconsciously recognise what the right thing is to do in that situation. These assumptions are often unwritten, and it's around people's interpretation or perception of what good or bad looks like. If you do work in an organisation now, you might well have attended the corporate induction, but that won't tell you really how the organisation works. You learn that through your interaction with colleagues and friends that you work with. That perhaps is a way of illustrating culture in action. The most frequent way of presenting Shine's theory of culture is to see his description of culture as an iceberg. So the visible part of the iceberg would be the artifacts, so the things that we can see. So in that organisation sense, they are the buildings, the dress, the way people talk to you. Whereas the values and assumptions are hidden and cannot be seen. So the values may be easier to get to because they're near the surface, but the assumptions are deeply hidden and cannot be seen. But there are some issues with this metaphor. And firstly, the iceberg would lead you to perceive culture as a static, fixed or frozen thing, just like the image. And culture is much more dynamic and changing than that. Let me explain. An alternative way, or even a more accurate way, of describing Shine's work is as a lily pond. So the artifacts are visible, the flowers and the lily pads, but the values and assumptions are below the water. But rather than seeing culture as a fixed object, an edifice, just like the iceberg, it's rather an ecosystem, one that each component relies on each other and can be dynamic and changing over time. And that is a more appropriate use of metaphor in terms of describing Shine's work. Moving on then to consider Charles Handy's work in 1985, so the same year. He takes a much more functional perspective at explaining or understanding culture within organisation, and he identifies 4 particular types of culture that he's observed in organisations, and those are cultures such as power, role, task and person, and I'll explain a little more in each of those. Handy's work provides us 4 descriptions of cultures that he found in organisations. This isn't to present good or bad cultures, but just ways of understanding the way culture might present itself. As you can see from the screen, he set out the detail that helps to articulate and identify the types of cultures found. Within healthcare, it's interesting to apply these to consider the different cultures. So, for example, in terms of power, where successful solutions, the problems are identified, performance is judged by results and problems solved, that there's flexibility in the culture, loosely bound, that power influenced from various positions may well be found in teams such as research teams or even in operating theatres, where there are very clear and different roles that all contribute to the successful outcomes. The role culture, so based around job, hierarchical, predictable, stable, often inflexible or rigid, for me may well capture the broader context of the culture in the NHS as a whole organisation, whereas power may specifically relate to a localised cultural team, so for example operating theatres. Task culture, so has a central figure for strength, communication radiating from that central point, often small organisations. Now in the NHS, in healthcare context, that actually might relate to specific projects. So, for example, if you've got a project to implement a change within an area, then actually that might display a culture much more consistent with task. And then finally, person culture, which Handy suggested was rare, focuses on the individual. It's not common for an entire organisation. And for me, it's perhaps best articulated by the role of a consultant within the NHS. So a medical a doctor or surgeon is often accountable primarily to their college rather than the organisation itself, and that creates a different cultural perspective. But again, what this shows is that all four of these different types of cultures could be operating within one organisation at the same time, and again starts to highlight the complexity when we try to understand culture. The third model I'm presenting here is reference to Johnson 1992, but was also developed earlier with Johnson and Scholes in 1989, and is one that they describe as the organisational cultural web. They take a much more complex or dynamic perspective of how we understand culture, which for me really brings together the work of both Handy and Shine to recognise the contingent nature of an understanding culture. So what I mean by that is they identify the following areas that make up this cultural web. If we think about the way Shine spoke about culture and behaviours being learnt as a result of maybe failings within an organisation, then the stories and myths are the way those events are told and retold by staff, and staff that may well have never actually been around at the time of the original event, but are reinforcing those behaviours through the retelling of these stories and myths about what happened. And similarly, rituals and routines are the regular, normal behaviour, so what's expected on a day-to-day basis. And those behaviours, again, are learnt through the relationship with the stories and myths as they're told about what happens in that particular organisation. Symbols are probably much similar to the artefacts in Shine's work, so the visible elements, the way the organisation can be seen. And the organisation structure perhaps is more in relation to the hierarchy of the way individuals report to one another. And as Johnson suggests, that's both a formal organisation structure from chief executive to directors to team leads and so on, but also the informal structure as to where relationships are valued. Control systems is the way that when things go well or when things go wrong are managed and maintained. Those reinforce the way the organisation works. And of course then finally the power structures. So these are the way behaviours are controlled and managed, and so within a healthcare setting that could be ward sisters or team leaders or consultants, all of them enacting some form of control over the way things are done. And it's a relationship between these elements that Johnson and Scholes argue is a way of understanding culture. So in understanding about leadership and culture, we want to explore this issue as to whether culture can change. Because if we accept our understanding of leadership as having an impact on culture, then we have to assume that it can change. So in terms of asking that question, can culture change? There are two possible arguments to this that we can find in the literature. The first one is yes, more than likely, and it's an optimistic approach that says as a result of the actions we can take, maybe through our understanding and interpretation of Johnson and Scholes' works or Handy's works, for example, we can understand the culture that the organisation has by observing the artefacts, understanding and questioning the values, and maybe reflecting on and seeking out the assumptions that are more deeply hidden. And therefore we can assess it, and we can therefore look at changing the way those assumptions are developed. The aim of this approach would see leadership influencing culture with a view to improve quality within the organisation through changing and influencing the assumptions and values that people have, supporting that through addressing and altering the artefacts, the way the organisation is seen. The counterposition to this is that actually changing culture is the wrong question altogether. And those authors will see culture as far more complicated, far more complex a subject. They argue that rather than culture being something that that an organisation has, that we can explore, that we can surgically understand and remove parts and replace others, they would argue that culture is deeply embedded in the way we all engage with one another, which perhaps takes us back to the very start of the idea of social anthropology, and really understanding, and at best what we can do is secure insights in terms of the way people do or don't operate, in terms of the way they work. Such an approach, at best, in terms of its relationship with changing culture, would be seeing changes at a very low level, at a micro level within the organisation, so on the ground. And from that, we start to see change occurring. Whereas the optimist would see the ability to maybe affect change in culture across the whole organisation. So they're both coming at this issue from different perspectives. One sees culture as manageable, as identifiable and changeable. The other has a much more complex relationship with culture and sees it as far less a malleable product, but it is something still that can be understood and shaped. I really like this paper by Mannion and Davis from 2018, last year, which really for me brings back to the point and the complexity of our understanding culture. So they're arguing, rather than just seeing culture as something an organisation has that we can manipulate, and rather than being defeatist and saying we just cannot influence culture, they argue about, as they say, paying greater attention to the multi-layered and multifaceted complexity underlying the term, that being culture, and recognising that many and varied cultural subgroups make up our healthcare organisations. And this opens new avenues for understanding the deeply social and discursive nature of complex organisations. So what that means to me is that if we see in the literature quick fixes or simple solutions or how to be a leader in 5 days that can influence and change culture, then we need to be potentially cynical of those approaches, because what this latest research shows us is acknowledging just how complex organisations' culture and therefore leadership is, meaning we need to develop a much more considered view of how we develop leaders in the future. So to summarise culture as this complex subject, what is culture? Well, it is often spoken about and talked about in organisations, but it is difficult to define. Culture is important because understanding culture does make you consider what matters and what matters to people. The way things are done around here may well be too simple an understanding of what culture is. But a misunderstanding of what culture is could also impact on the way you develop yourself as a leader. So culture in healthcare is important and it's complex. And you need to consider the different layers, subcultures and teams across the large organisations that you either work now or may work in the future. Culture does change. It certainly changes over time. The question is less clear is whether it's as a result of your actions as a leader or as a result of the general and natural development of people's view of the organisation. So I would say what is important from all of this is, as a leader, to start to be able to consider and recognise the complexity in terms of culture and find ways to better understand that, rather than to find ways to simplify or ignore that complexity, as that will prevent you from delivering the kind of changes that you might want to see.